Terrie Williams. Terrie got her bachelor's, master's, and PhD at Rutgers University. And a friend of mine at Rutgers said that Terrie is our claim to fame.
Oh, wait. I want to know who said that.
I'll tell you later. She then traveled the world, including Antarctica, Africa, and Alaska, studying the physiology of the largest mammals on Earth, from elephants to whales to cheetahs, lions, the endangered Hawaiian monk seal, Canadian narwhals, and sea otters. She is, in fact, a world expert in this area. Now, with many opportunities for employment, UCSC was lucky to get her, and she has been there since 1994 and is now a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology. So just down the road, up the road, I should say. The goal of her research is to understand how large animals survive in today's rapidly changing world, and she'll talk on that topic today.
Right. Thank you so much. That's like the nicest introduction I've ever gotten, because normally on my CV I've got like 15 different jobs that I've held, and it's like, no, she can't hold a job at all. It's not like they all wanted her. But I want to talk today about physiology more than anything else, and I don't know how many people here are physiologists, but it's something that is just near and dear to my heart. And right now I have, how physiological tipping points are dictating vulnerability of large mammals to anthropogenic disturbance. And it's really down to this. This is what we do. We are trying to conserve basically the big mammals of the world and what I consider some of the super athletes that are out there. And I get a lot of people sort of asking, well, why big mammals? And is it just because they're charismatic and you're just sort of messing around with critters? Is that the idea here? And there's actually a method to my madness in all of this. And that's, wait a minute. I can't even hold my glasses here. And that is when you start looking at the range of animals that are out there, and for any of you that were at Jim Estes' talk last week, you have a sense already that large animals are sort of the glue that hold a lot of ecosystems together, especially if you believe these top-down forcings that occur. And when you look amongst all of these big carnivores, there's a tipping point that occurs at a body mass more than 21.5 kilograms. And you can go back to this paper by Corbon. It sort of gives you a sense of where it comes from. But there's an element of you're big, you need a lot of calories, and you're going to have to kill either a lot of things or you're going to have to kill a lot of big things in order for you to survive. And that's going to have an enormous impact on the environment in which these animals live. And that's why my lab has focused on this. And when you start to look at the IUCN list of endangered species, and this is just showing you listings of endangered carnivores, so some of these animals that I study, from 1980 to 2010, it just ratchets up and up and up. And we're seeing these large charismatic animals disappearing, and it astounds me for a variety of reasons. One is the poor knowledge we have of the basic biology of these kinds of animals. And the other part of it being people just say, but we love these animals, and yet we have 25% of all mammals endangered. We have more than 50% showing population declines. And the question is, why is it? And if you go through those IUCN listings, almost invariably it says habitat destruction. For lack of anything else, it's that, well, the environment is changing, therefore it's habitat destruction in some sense. And this really bothered me as I looked across a lot of these large carnivores. And so I want to explore a little bit of that today. And I want to start by saying or asking, what does this really mean to the animal? When you look at it from an animal perspective, what is happening when you say habitat destruction? And then how does the anthropogenic disturbances manifest itself biologically? What is really going on with these animals? And the bottom line is, can they take it? And then just to finish up with, can physiological tools help to address some of these conservation issues? And are we using them wisely? So what does it mean to an animal when we say habitat destruction? What is it that these animals are trying to do? And when you look at it, if you really boil it down to what these big carnivores have to do, it's really foraging biology in the sense of there is a cost, an energetic cost for these animals running around their environment, and they're going to get a benefit from whatever it is they're able to catch and eat. And it's the balance between these two that ultimately is going to dictate whether we're going to see these animals survive or not. So when you look at it in reality, though, if you want a population to survive, you've got to have an animal that's going to bring in more energy than it's going to expend. So as we look at it in terms of just studying these animals, for the energy in, it's fairly easy. Energy in is just food. Can we monitor how much these animals are eating? The energy out gets really complicated because there's so many ways in which these animals are losing energy. These are just four of the big ones, but they have to have a certain amount of energy that they take in food that's going to maintain maintenance functions. They got thermal functions. Within this, we might have specific dynamic action type functions, so how they digest food. There's energy going into activity, and then energy that's going into growth and reproduction. If an animal, if an individual accomplishes this, if it brings in enough food to basically take care of those functions, you're going to get the individual surviving. That's where energy in equals energy out. But if we want to have population survival, you're going to have to be back up here, where they're bringing in more energy, and they're not only surviving, but they're creating youngsters that are going to help with the population growth. So I looked at these things and I said, what is a likely magnitude of response to habitat changes here? You know, if we're saying that this is a big deal for these animals, that energy is sort of the bottom line, and that you have to have enough on board if you want to have a population grow, which one of these things are going to be affected? And maybe we can do something to make sure that these animals are going to be able to bring in the energy for each one of these areas. I did one of the most boring studies of my entire career by looking at the basic basal metabolism. This is a sea lion sitting underneath a metabolic hood. And we had 5 sea lions involved in this project. Some were pregnant, reproductive, some were non-reproductive, and we looked at them for over 2 years. Every single month we measured basic resting metabolism in these animals to just see what happens with the maintenance costs for these animals, especially if they were pregnant, which was here, and if they were lactating and post-lactation here. So they had a pup too. And even though there's a bit of a decline here, the only thing the decline is telling us is that the animals got better at sitting in the metabolic hood and resting. It just didn't change. Yeah, I mean, basically the bottom line metabolism, maintenance metabolism, just didn't change with all these things that are happening. Yes, they bring in more food when they're lactating, but the food is going into milk and it's going out. And if you look at just what the maintenance metabolism was of the mom, nothing changed. So for maintenance metabolism, at best, what I'm seeing is maybe a 1.5 to 2-fold change in metabolism that can occur. Thermal is another thing that we've looked at. So we can take an animal, look at its oxygen consumption. This is a Hawaiian monk seal that we've been working with. Look at oxygen consumption in relation to water temperature, get a thermal neutral zone, see where lower critical temperatures are, and then look at how far we can drive up that metabolism if we make the water temperature, in this case, higher or lower. And again, even though you're seeing changes in metabolism, this is not a make it or break it for these animals in terms of the amount of energy that they're bringing on board, unless you have extreme temperatures. And if you have extreme temperatures, if the animals get to an environment like that, if it's acute and severe, they're just going to outright die. This is, dolphins getting caught in a cold snap in a bay, can't get out, they lose so much core temperature and they just die. Most of the time though, and this sort of falls into the climate change scenario, if it's chronic and severe, the animals just leave. And that's what we're seeing more and more now. If you pay attention to sort of the latitudinal changes, or for some of these species, altitudinal changes. They simply go to where temperature is going to put them into that thermal neutral zone. And that brings us into the third category, activity. And this is one where you really start to see a major change in metabolism. If we took, and in this case it was harbor seals and sea lions, we look at oxygen consumption in relation to swimming speed, and you see exponential increases in the amount of energy these animals are using as they are moving faster and faster. And you can see pretty enormous changes. You can have a change in metabolism that can be on the order of 60 to 20-fold, depending on the species in which you're looking, or the species you're looking at. And this really concerns me in terms of a day-to-day basis. If you're trying to make it, anything, in my mind, anything that causes an animal to move more is going to potentially push it over the edge in terms of bringing in enough prey for it to make it versus the population to make it. And any one of a number of things can do this. This can be simply moving to new resources, moving to new environments that are thermally compatible with them, escaping predators that have now come in, subduing prey that they may have never fed on, defending resources because the resources are being compressed into smaller and smaller environments with your habitat destruction. To me, this is something that we need to pay attention to, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So how is this anthropogenic disturbance manifested biologically? I just sort of gave you the energy ins and outs, and we decided to start looking at some big animals and just say, how active are animals, and is the activity level changing as we have the animal in a perturbed environment? We use a lot of different technology for this. A lot of these animals are fairly cryptic, and so we'll do everything from direct observation of foraging and activity patterns in sea otters. We use video cameras a lot, so it's critter cam type instrumentation. It isn't that brand necessarily, but my gosh, you know, go out and get some GoPros and put them on animals. It is one, the funniest thing you'd ever want to do, but two, it really gives you an insight from the animal perspective what's going on. This is an African lion that we worked with. We spend a lot of time in the Antarctic. You can imagine the seals are diving underwater, so we put a camera on the head and we can follow these animals and just see what do the environments of these animals look like. And I want to show you just one clip from African lions. So the camera is on the neck of this animal, and it's currently just sitting there. And I want to show you just sort of, you know, a little bit of activity here from these lions. So a tourist vehicle has come in, you know, and it's watching it. You got to wait for it here. And then there it is. And you sort of wait. And you keep on waiting, and then the lion just pretty well gets bored and goes back to sleep. The most boring animal in the world is the African lion. It has videotapes that give you about a microsecond of fun stuff, and then 99% of it is just sitting around doing nothing. Lazy animals. So because of that, we went to something a little bit more active in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And we're studying mountain lions, and they do a heck of a lot more than an African lion. We are using and developing something called a smart collar. And if you guys ever want to know the secret to NSF funding, make something. We teamed up, my lab teamed up with environmental studies. Chris Wilmers is helping to do the field logistics of this thing. And then the engineering department helped to develop the bits and pieces of the collar I'm going to explain in a minute. But that integration went to sort of a technology group. It's the IDBR, I think is the acronym. And it was amazing. They funded just to get the collar made. We went out and had a heck of a good time doing some science with mountain lions. So something for you guys to consider. They have a big budget, or at least had one. So the collar itself, it's basically species movement, acceleration, and radio tracking. The elements of it is that it has a fast link GPS so that we can monitor the animals fairly quickly, even though they're in a forested area. The big difference in these collars is the addition of these accelerometers, a 3-axis accelerometer and magnetometer that tells us what the animal is doing in its environment as you are tracking it. So the way that these collars work is they require a lot of calibration, and that's where my lab comes in. The first thing we need to do is figure out the behavioral signals that are matched to all these accelerometer signals. And we do that by videotaping and observing animals that are wearing the collars. The great thing about doing these accelerometer kinds of studies is that the biomechanics of runners is just so well known. It's pretty much for a quadruped walking and trotting and galloping, or some variation of that. And they move in predictable ways. They move at speeds that are predictable. Their gait transition speeds are predictable. And that gives us a really handy way to start classifying what the accelerometer signals are telling us. We did these studies with some captive mountain lions in Colorado. We had 3 adult mountain lions, 2 males, 1 females. They were 65.7 kilograms. We put the collars on them, and then we just monitored them doing whatever they needed to do in a large natural compound, and we videotaped them. So we had a videotape record on top of a diary on top of an accelerometer signal. And we had them do a 20-meter race course. The great thing is that they're semi-trained. They would kill you if they could, but they at least responded to meat. And so you could have them, run back and forth across a race course and look at them moving at different speeds, from walking to sprinting, and then all the other things that you might want to know about lions in the wild. So resting and panting and grooming, etc., climbing and jumping. The accelerometer signals that we would get, I've just got a couple of examples up there in relation to time, but you get sort of a fuzzy signal right here if an animal is eating and chomping on things here. If the animal turns its head, or if it's going incline or decline, we get a change here. And this becomes important when you start to look at animals that are walking uphill and downhill. So we can see that from these collars. And then the great thing, and this is where I'm really excited, and I'm hoping to get the manuscript out soon, is that every single paw hit on the ground is a spike on the collar. That means we can count up how many hits on the ground, divide it by 4, we get 60 strides per minute, and we can correlate it to a speed for the animal. And it's a step-by-step analysis that is a level of detail I've just never seen, and I'm really excited about. And then here's what 45 strides would look like, and then the animal's moving slower. So we now have the ability to say, here's how fast an animal is moving across its environment, and how many steps did it take to get there, as opposed to 2 GPS points and something happened in between. So here was the big risk that ONR took, or not ONR, sorry, that NSF took, and they didn't know it was a risk. But I said that I could put a mountain lion on a treadmill. And so this was to correlate the behavior and the accelerometer to an actual metabolic cost. I'm not interested in just where the animal is going. I want to know, what did it cost it to get there. So this is the animal in the metabolic chamber. We had to weld this thing together, and the first thing it did on top was nothing. And then the second thing it did was climb on top of it, which made us glad that we had welded this thing. And I want to show you, and this is mostly for like grad students, I want to show you just one outtake and then eventually what happened. So this is a video. This is the early on training. And this was one animal that skateboarded. So if you take a look, 2 paws are moving and 2 paws are not. So we had half the cat going, and you can see it takes a lot of meat to get this animal going forward. And then eventually we got to this. Yeah, the animal's in a metabolic chamber. It's going up an incline, and I'll show you a little bit later. Going up an incline for a mountain lion is not an easy thing to do. But we measure oxygen consumption using that metabolic chamber. We take the excurrent air and get an energetic cost. So here's what we found for our mountain lions. We have, there are 3 strides, 3 gaits. walk, trot, and sprint, and they're color-coded there. The vertical lines correspond to what was predicted for the gait transition speeds, and you can see that they match up embarrassingly well. And this is very, very different than an African lion. African lions have a completely different program. We'll talk about that later, but they don't do this sort of 3-gait transition. Mountain lions did. It was right as predicted. And what we found is that if you left the mountain lion to do what it wanted to, it would move across the ground at about 1 meter per second. That's what a mountain lion is built to do, or at least it's preferring to do. The oxygen consumption is just like every other quadruped that we've put onto a treadmill. It goes up linearly until you get to some V.O2 max level. This is the BMR from McNabb's studies. So nothing too surprising there. If you add an incline, you can then push the mountain lion, up. Not surprising, except I thought if you were a mountain lion, maybe you'd be able to go up an incline a little bit better than some other animals, but not so. In terms of efficiency of going up an incline, they're pretty much like another quadruped. So there isn't a cost to going uphill and downhill as opposed to just running on the level. And so now we had our energetic signatures. We now had energy correlated to rest when the animal was just alert, sitting, preferred walking at 1 meter per second than if we went to a fast walk and to a run. So we felt pretty good. That's on the level. And the cost per stride, so each one of those footfalls for our lion was 5.9 joules per kilogram per stride. And that was within 7% of what was predicted for other quadrupeds by Taylor and company in 1982. So we felt like we were looking at a pretty standard quadruped. This was not some fancy kind of cat. If I take all of those oxygen consumption measurements and I compress them down, so this is what you saw on the previous graph, and then I throw in the incline, you can see what happens to the animal. The green shows you the extra cost of going up an incline for them. And the animals get anaerobic very quickly. I was very surprised at this. The animal at that 1 meter per second can stay within aerobic limits, but once it starts going to fast walks and to runs, it really taxes the mountain lions. And again, I was actually fairly shocked at how quickly you could get an animal going anaerobic. I didn't expect that for this cat. And if you look at the cost per stride, it was about almost 2 times. It was 1.8 times moving on the level. So the bottom line in this is that it costs these cats significantly to go up and down hills. So now that we've got everything correlated. We've got a collar with an accelerometer on it. We know the energetic cost that's associated with the biomechanics, and the biomechanics are now, and the speed are matched to the signals coming out of those accelerometers. We went to the wild and we said, what happens in the Santa Cruz Mountains? So we have over 30 adult mountain lions that are tagged with a variety of tags, some just GPS, in the mountains. They include males and females, as well as females with kittens. There are GPS and radio tag animals that are just for locating them, where are they going. And then there are others that have these accelerometers on them at an intermittent schedule so that we can look at it at different seasons. This is pretty data intensive and battery intensive, and so you can't leave something like this running for a year. It's not going to happen. So we're sort of choosing our times. We're sampling at 64 hertz in 3 axes on a collar subset. Eventually, the idea is to compress these signatures into a decision tree and really truly make it a smart collar, where it just simply gives you, instead of all these bouncing lines, it just says your animal is walking, it's resting, it's panting, it's doing this, and here's how long and where they did it and how long they did it each day. So our study area is the Santa Cruz Mountains. The star is our campus right there. And so this is prime mountain lion habitat. It's bounded by the ocean on one side and Silicon Valley on the other, with this highway that runs right down the middle of it to complicate matters. And here's what they do, just in terms of a GPS track. They have no problem going up and down all the hillsides and such. If the animals have a road, they will take a road. So they will follow the easy course whenever they can. But the idea that they're going to avoid any of these inclines really at a certain level isn't there. They're climbing all over the place. As far as energetic cost of mountain travel, what we found for a female with no kittens and a female with kittens and a male in some ways was similar for all three groups. If you look at this according to time of day, dawn and dusk for everybody was important, and that if you were a male, your energetic costs were a lot higher than for female with kittens or a female, not unusual given the size differences. The one big difference here was that these females with kittens would hunt all day long. So if you've got a small pet and you've got a female with kittens around, you might want to keep it inside, because that's going to be probably the most dangerous time. The most dangerous time basically is dawn and dusk. But if you've got an animal with kittens, it becomes across the board. In terms of what was driving the energetic differences for these animals, it was how far did they move and what were the inclines that were encountered. So these are the relative movement or relative ranges for our three groups of animals. And you can see those males really wandered all over the place, as opposed to females that tend to stay in a pretty prescribed range versus a female with kittens that's going to explore a little bit more just because of that added need to kill. So what happens when we see some sort of predation? What is, I wanted to do the anatomy of a kill. I thought this would be really interesting. What are we going to see on our accelerometers? The great thing is that with the GPS collars and that fast link, we can, by looking at a place or looking at GPS hits where you're getting hit after hit after hit, these are giving us information about 4 times an hour. If an animal is sitting in one spot, chances are it's killed something. So our team can go out and they can locate a carcass fairly well. I've been really impressed. We can do it for big things. Small things, it's a lot harder to try and get that accelerometer signal, and we'll have to see if we can pull it out for rabbits. I think they can do that. But here are 4 animals I just want to show you, and a lot of this has to do with just the variety of movement patterns that we saw. These are 2 females. They're about 40 kilograms. And then we had 2 males that we looked at, and you can see the size is much larger. They're about 60 kilograms. And very different patterns in terms of hunting. So this is a 3-hour piece of time that we have from the accelerometer that takes you to a predation event, and the patterns are quite different. The other thing was that the females tended to kill the biggest animals, and so they're tackling the big bucks. The males are killing the baby fawns. So here's a male, and it basically would wander around the countryside. It had to get quiet because this is an older fawn, and then it would kill it. This guy is just tromping around, and these things are sort of hidden by mom. These are fawns that are so small, they're basically staying in one spot, and he's just wandering around until he finds one and then eats it. It was amazing that these large males went for the smallest prey items, and we could see it on the accelerometers. As far as matching behaviors, I'm just going to color code it here, but you can get a sense of what we get. The gray is showing you the periods of time that the animals were intensively changing incline. So they were going up and down hills as they were hunting around. The red here is showing you the actual pounce. So when the animals hit the prey item. And again, we knew the timing of this. We had the GPS hits, went out and found the carcasses, so we knew what they had gotten for this. The blue is sort of the stalking, when the times when the animals were moving very, very slowly. And it's fun looking at the accelerometers because you can see like they're these long, slow footfalls. Instead of those spikes when they're running, you get sort of this gradual kind of movement, and you get the sense of the animal just sort of moving very, very cryptically to hit the prey. But again, very different for our 4 animals. And then the green is just wandering around. Basically, it's out there searching for the prey item before it gets into a point that they're actually going to try and kill it. So if we look at this one female, I just want to sort of blow up what she did and give you a sense of what the anatomy of a kill looks like. So this animal was in the Santa Cruz Mountains. She came down out of a mountainous area and then at 2 o'clock in the morning ended up in an area that was just inhabited by humans. She went from that area to, over a couple of hours, moved 236 meters. This is the point that she did the kill in somebody's backyard. So she was using all of this development basically to see where the deer had come in. This was a deer kill. She then did the kill here. She moved uphill a little bit, spent most of the day hanging out there, probably digesting one heck of a crazy meal. She then moved down the mountainside the next evening, came back to the kill site. This is close enough where we think she came back and fed on it, and then by the next morning had moved off. So these animals aren't necessarily avoiding human habitation, and in fact the females tend to be pretty tolerant. There's a paper by Chris Wilmers as the lead author. They're pretty tolerant to the fact that humans are there and they use it to their advantage, sometimes getting themselves in trouble. So let's take a look at the actual kill itself. This is the accelerometer trace. This is 15 minutes of our trace, and then this pounce is right there. And I want to show you the detail that we can get from these animals. So we've got our trace right here. If I blow it up, this is what you're getting. These are the footfalls right there. If you take 4 of those, so each one of the paws have hit the ground, you've got 1 stride. And then we were finding this, at this point, the animal was moving at 110 strides per minute. We know from that, from the video we did calibrating it, we have a fast trot going on. The animal's moving at 3 meters per second, and that's how much energy it expended to travel. You can go to the chase. The animal then went to 120 strides per minute. This is really fast, 4 meters per second, 8 times resting. So the animal is really starting to move fast there. It's obviously found something of interest. Then it slows itself down progressively. So it goes from 105 to 79 strides per minute. Here are the speeds. It's getting down into that sort of, stalking maneuver. Here's how much energy it's expending at that point. Then the pounce, and in this particular case, the animal missed. So it was like, it went through all of that, and then this is like the head down, slow walk, missed it, 1 meter per second. Here's how much energy. In truth, what she did was she recovered herself, moved very slowly, and then killed the animal right there. So it was a double pounce that she ended up doing, and eventually got the deer. So the cost of all of that for just that 15-minute period of time was 757 kilojoules to make the kill, and that represented about 3% of the energy ingested in the meal, knowing the maximum amount of meat these animals can bring on board, and they tend to eat as much as they can and then try to go back to a kill. And that this just little period of time, this high intensity activity, was 3.9% of the predicted field metabolic rate for this animal. That's if the animal did it on level. When we add the incline, things start to change. So now you can see that the kill is about 1,400 kilojoules for the kill. That's representing 5.4% of the energy that she's going to ingest in that meal. And you're now up to 7% of the predicted field metabolic rate. So these intensive activities cost these animals, and it's a balance between when you're preying on things, how much energy you're going to expend for that, how much energy you're going to expend wandering around the countryside to find things, and then how much your total field metabolic rate is. So here's the game changers. I wanted to talk a little bit about human disturbance, just so you can see how it changes things. In Santa Cruz, they did a great thing for drivers and a really bad thing for mountain lions. They put in this cement divide on Highway 17. So this definitely was the most harrowing place. If you guys have ever driven that road, you know what that thing is like. And people were head-oning all the time. And they put in the divider, which seemed like a good idea, except for two things. One, the mountain lions couldn't move across their territory. They were moving back and forth here all the time. They couldn't do it because of this barrier. If they found a place that was open, so like on this side, they can get over to here and see the cars, but they get to this point and they've got to make a jump blindly into traffic. And we've actually lost about a quarter of our research animals as a result of hits here and depredation permits when they've gotten into farms. So it's truly been a game changer for our mountain lions. I'm not going to talk about that one in detail. The bottom line is you can read the paper by Terrie Williams. What the mountain lions are doing is, instead of going back and forth here, there's a corridor area that they tend to use, and you can sort of see in this paper, it's PLOS One, Wilmers 2013, and you can see where the animals are going across the road. And what we're hoping is that we can get Caltrans to essentially build a tunnel underneath the thing and let the animals cross where they're naturally starting to congregate. It may change things, we'll see. The one I will talk about though, and this was just insane, in the middle of our study, we had the Lockheed fire. And it was a massive fire in 2009. It was 7,800 acres that was burned right in the middle of prime mountain lion habitat, and was started by a campfire. It just got out of control. So here's what happened from the mountain lion perspective. Here's 2009 before the fire. So this is the sort of female tracks all over the place, and this is where she was sort of focusing a lot of her predation or her foraging. This is what happened after the fire. So this is the area of the fire on both of these, and she was pushed up in this direction. She was pushed higher into the mountains, and in actual fact pushed over the other side of the mountain. So she moved off of what was, sort of her normal area near the coast, and then higher up into the mountains. And if we look at really what happened to this animal, here's where we started to discover the physiological tipping point for the mountain lion. That what I didn't tell you on the graph before, when we get this linear increase in oxygen consumption here, and we have this increase here, it doesn't take much when the animal is on an incline to reach VO2 max. And they reach it fairly quickly, where a dog or a human even might have a VO2 max about 10 to 12 times resting. We're seeing 6, 7, 8 times resting for the mountain lion. And that really made me wonder, are these animals built, are felids built differently than other quadrupeds, even ourselves? So we started looking at the heart mass. Because relative heart mass is going to dictate VO2 max, and you can look up this paper by Bishop, because there's a correlation there, we simply ask the question, if we're seeing lower VO2 maxes for our cats, is it because they're built differently than other animals? So we were able to get the hearts from these animals that had been killed both in Colorado and in California. And this is what we found. Heart mass was 0.42% of body mass in the mountain lion. And it followed the patterns we've seen for other felids. You can go from tiger to domestic cat, and there's African lions and jaguars and things in there. Pretty much for the felids, at least these larger, and including domestic cat, but for the larger felids, all of these animals are showing about 0.42% of body mass in terms of the heart mass. This is what you see for canids and horses and humans, almost double. The heart mass is 0.8 to 1% of body mass in all of these other groups. And in fact, if you're a human, you can be untrained at 0.8 and you can get yourself up to 1% if you're a marathoner. So we're finding that in terms of aerobic capacity for these felids, they're different. These animals are built different, and they are not built to go at a high sprinting level. I don't have the heart mass of a cheetah. That is the one thing I really, really want. But there is an urban legend out there about cheetahs have really big hearts, they have really big lungs, they have really big noses, and you're going, do they really? And I've never found the data. If you guys have data on this, I've never found it, because it seems like everyone's just saying, oh yeah, if you're going to be a runner, you're going to have all these things. And I don't think it was ever measured, because here you've got the most anaerobic thing in the world, and it's going to have a big aerobic capability. I'm going to lay money, I don't think so. I'll bet you that in fact it's going to start looking like these animals, and it's going to just be able to handle anaerobic better than aerobic. Anyway, bottom line here is that these felids are really very different, and it makes me rethink about how I would move big felids versus big canids. You could have coyotes and they were in that same fire zone. They can run and run and run and run. Doesn't make any difference. They are champions of endurance. Here, though, is what we did to the mountain lion. This is before the fire. Oops. This is before the fire. This is in a coastal zone, so the ocean is actually down here. And relatively speaking, this is pretty flat area. It's the same thing that's up here, and then this is what was happening afterwards. The animal was up and down the back end of the mountains, going into Silicon Valley and getting herself in trouble. And it resulted in massive changes in how much of the day was spent in incline walking. In fact, a 57% increase, given that the high cost of incline walking was impacting that. These are the kinds of joules per day that were being added onto this animal simply because you took her and you forced her over the side of the cliff by that fire. And development can do the same kinds of things. Now, the amazing thing about these cats is that these kinds of movements are happening in ways that we've never anticipated. You know, here is a mountain lion that went 2,000 miles, and it was one of those things. It was followed by camera traps, by DNA that was collected from fur traps across the area. And the amazing thing is that here it is in Dakota, got itself all the way across the country. Actually, it sort of came up through Canada, I believe, and came down, and then died in Connecticut because a car hit it. And you're just going, you know, it just sort of spoke to me in terms of pushing animals, the animals trying to adapt in a way that its biology is going to allow it to happen, and then the public just not being prepared for a mountain lion to come screaming across the road. So these human disturbances can make the animals do things that you would never even imagine possible, and it's these tags and this kind of technology that's showing us sort of where the conflict is happening. Here's another one. This is a comparison of some of the other felids. Are mountain lions different, or is the cost of moving the same for some of the other felids? And I already told you that the hearts are pretty similar. So here's domestic cat, cost of transport. Here's a cheetah, cost of transport. Here is our mountain lion. This line right here and all the green points are for canids, and this is work that had been done by Taylor in the 80s in his group. Bottom line is that all these cats look pretty good except for our African lion. Remember, I told you at the very beginning, laziest animal in the world, and they form prides very different, you know, these social hunting animals, very different than we see for the others. And I suspect it's because it costs these animals so much to move around that there's a whole new social system to hunting big things, and there's a reason that you're seeing them just laze around. Each cost for the lion, this is African lion, each cost is tremendous for every single step there. This is what the mountain lion does in terms of either speed or stride frequency and how much it costs it per step. So really different kind of felid. And so in terms of human disturbance, the African lion is going to have a tougher time than some of these other animals that we see. So just sort of the last part in sort of a summing thing. Do I think that physiological tools address conservation issues, or can they? Yeah. It's like I wouldn't have done this if I didn't think so. But here's what's happening, and here's how we've sort of looked at it. In my lab, I I'll have students come in and they want to study various animals, and I'll say, you can study this thing, but I want to see where this is going to go application-wise. Can you tell me, for an elephant, what would be the tipping point for an animal? And they start thinking and they go, well, they're really big. Thermal issues might be something that we might look at. The ability to lose heat. It's really hot in Africa, different deserts that these animals live in. So Robin Duncan said, I'm going to look at evaporative water loss because these animals don't have sweat glands. So you have big animal, tough to lose heat, living in hot desert environments, drought is occurring there, and what happens when they try to lose heat and how did they do that? You can look at her paper, but basically it linked evaporative water loss to the ability to withstand drought in these large animals. We've done this for Hawaiian monk seals. This is a tropical seal, really different. We've already killed the Caribbean monk seal. It's extinct now. And so given that, here you have this odd tropical animal. What are the energetic costs of an animal trying to dive in hot water? Very different. And so we've looked at aerobic dive limits and say, how deep can these animals dive and how far can you push them offshore? They're now diving to 500 meters, which technically they shouldn't be able to do. And we're using that to define critical habitats for these animals. The narwhal. This was a study built on nothing more than muscle oxygen stores. We had some samples, we looked at how the muscles were built, and then developed a story on how deep can they dive, how long can they hold their breath, and what is happening when you have bigger and bigger ice flows coming in this changing Arctic scene. And then the newest one, this one will probably get me in one heck of a lot of trouble, and it's cardiovascular function and oceanic noise impacts on cetaceans. So it has to do with, can marine mammals get the bends? And we're finding that there are changes to the dive response that we never in our wildest dreams imagined would happen. And it being triggered in many ways by a flight response associated with noise. So we'll see if we get that one out. That one's controversial. So in terms of my bottom line, can you save a species when you don't know its biology? And this inherently people understand, but the question is, are we really doing a disservice by not trying to pay attention to the biology of these animals? So I did just a literature search. I had endangered mammals, and I took 3 endangered cetaceans, 3 pinnipeds that were endangered, 3 felids, and 3 canids, and just said, where are people publishing papers? Who's doing the science here? And you can see, hands down, for all of these animals, there are population studies. We are counting these animals. We're saying they're endangered. We're doing this kind of ecological work. We're getting some handle at the molecular level, at the disease level. You're doing some behavior, you get to foraging and diet, and then when you get to the real physiology, in many cases for these animals, the answer was 0. There were no studies done. I can tell you for the monk seal, there had been 1 physiology study done, period. And that is an animal where you have 1,100 left, and you're going to try and save them, and you know nothing about their physiology. It just seemed like a crime. So it's just a plug for physiology, but really a plug for integrating all of these kinds of biology in order to try and conserve these species. So, bottom line, I feel that these animals are exquisitely built for the environment in which they live or originally lived. In other words, we've got 50 to 100 million years of physiological evolution that's behind the animals that we are looking at now. And I think that we're challenging these animals by a lot of these anthropogenic kinds of factors, and just by making them move more, we're impacting them in a large way. And as far as the mammals that I've worked on, the funny thing is that at one level, they're all the same. You're looking at hearts and blood and lungs and muscles and kidneys and digestive tracts and all. they're built of the same stuff, but there's a variation on a theme that's going on with all of this. And if you can look at that variation, and if you can identify what makes them vulnerable, you're going to go a long way in trying to conserve any of these species. And that's what we're trying to do. What's the Achilles heel for each one of these species? You no longer can just use a Kleiber curve and say, I'm going to multiply by this and I'll know everything about all lions, all felids, all canids. It's a starting point, but I think we've done a disservice by not doing more. And then finally, I'm trying, and we'll see how well I do this. I want basically people to consider the physiological landscape in which these animals are living as we start to designate these critical habitats and reintroductions. And that really isn't done. If you read the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and a lot of recovery plans, it is based solely on ecological parameters. And as a result, that's why we see this great interest. You know, when I showed you the graph of all the publications, people are out there trying to do exactly what the law says, and that is study the ecology of these animals, provide certain kinds of information, and we're going to save them. And I think we can do better if you start to think of just how they are built. So I'm going to leave it at that. There were all kinds of funding agencies and groups that I worked with, a lot of students and other investigators involved, and I'll answer some questions for you. So thank you. So yeah, in the back.
Yeah, fascinating talk. I'll go look.
Uh-huh.
That collar with the excellent armament and the half of it you're putting it on the animal. Americans probably has to do pretty well for the excellent armament to work. So I'm wondering if it would be possible to also modify that device to directly get a certain animal's heart.
It's heart rate? Yeah. Oh, well, that's, that's yes and no. We actually do a lot of heart rate with the marine animals. And so that would be the whole other second talk about looking at heart rate. The thing that's hard about heart rate is that it requires several contact points. So in other words, you've got your instrument, and then even for you, if we were to measure heart rate, you know, those little Polar watch things that athletes put on, you need 2 electrode points generally in order to get a good EKG waveform. EKG is important because you don't want to pick up muscle noise. We've put just monitors on without an EKG and you're going, yeah, I don't know. So we actually have an instrument that we developed for marine mammals, and it has an accelerometer for stroking and an EKG monitor in it, and that's actually that cetacean study with the oceanic noise. It's all built on heart rate. It's hard to do it on these terrestrial animals unless you do surgery, because they're going to scrape them off, or they're going to, you know, trying to have electrodes on them is really hard externally. So it would mean, you know, putting instruments inside the animal, and that's just something we haven't gone for. There are a lot of studies that were done initially where people were just looking at heart rate on like bighorn sheep and that kind of thing. And you can go in the literature and see it. I never was convinced that just a heart rate gave you what you wanted to know. You needed heart rate and movement and you know, the mechanics of it, and that's new. So, but your question is good, and yeah, we actually have a unit.
You showed 5 matches of the untrained person and a marathoner, and I'm wondering, can something similar happen when mountain lion is moving from a flatter habitat to a more into a more mountainous habitat? Does it become better able to handle that habitat?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, and I don't have a good answer. You know, I can tell you for African lions, like I said, the laziest animal on earth, but for an African lion, we did this modeling exercise where we were going for, you know, basically looking, are the animals moving more? And they did just the opposite. What they did is under drought conditions, instead of moving more to other habitats, what they did was they learned all the ungulates were coming to watering holes that were limited. So the lions learned how to sit and do nothing and then just wait for the animals to come each day. And so they got lazier, and I'm sure their hearts probably are in pretty bad condition at this point. But yeah, I mean, you see animals that are in good body condition and some that are in poor, and I suspect you'd get that. But for a wild felid, for all the different cats that we looked at, it was 0.42%. We just didn't see a lot of variation in the heart. Now, if I looked at an animal in a zoo or something, it might look very different. And in fact, we did look at cheetah skeletal muscle. So we have a paper out from 1980, 90, something like that. And we looked at skeletal muscle and found that the cheetah muscle at the, unfortunately, San Diego Zoo where I was working, it almost looked like a disease process. It looked like somebody that had a cast put onto their arm, and you start to see different sizes of muscle fibers and all. So it happens, just like any athlete. So yeah. Yeah.
I actually have a related question. So in captive centers, I would expect the animals to be like an untrained animal, and in Colorado, I think it's pretty flat where that center is.
Mm-hmm.
And you're calibrating your energy estimates based on these animals. They're not moving the same way as they are in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So do you think that that is affecting your estimates of energy expenditure?
Yeah, and so we were trying to look at it in terms of body condition and body mass and such, and whether they were exercised or not. And the way that we tried to ensure that we were looking at what we called athletes was we started in 2009, and they were trained every single day on a treadmill for 2 years before we got to the point of doing the measurements. So part of the whole training process, just to get them to a point that they were steady on the treadmill and moving and all, we dealt with what they gave us in the enclosure in terms of speeds, because we felt that those were natural speeds for them. But the training, it was the best that we were going to get. Is it exactly the same as a wild animal? Probably not, but the best we could do is match size and condition and say reasonable condition given the circumstance. So yeah, I suppose you could say maybe some percentage lower, but relative, I don't think it'll change that much. But good question. Oops.
Maybe we can,
Got a quick one.
Yeah.
So, do you know much, I know there's literature out there and other stuff to know it, about the effect of the physiological effects of inclines and stuff with ectotherms compared to endotherms, where it's going to be presumably a much higher, because they don't have the high basal metabolic rate.
Yeah.
And you think about things like herpetologists, so, pencil, it just shoots up a tree, right?
Yeah.
It's a vertical thing, and it doesn't seem like it bothers them in the slightest. And I was just wondering if you knew much about that.
I don't, and I actually right before this I said, you got too many slides, I'll take this out. I had one graph that just showed body mass versus efficiency of incline running, but it was all for mammals, unfortunately. But the way that goes is it sort of starts down low, and if you're small, you tend to be fairly poor in terms of your efficiency in incline running, and then it goes up to an asymptote where you've got everybody that's big, more than 25 kilos, all about the same with some variation in there. For an ectotherm, now that's a good question, and also for birds that do this, like quail that are running straight up a tree. I don't know. I wish I did, but if I come across anything, I'm happy to look at it. But you're right. And these animals, the thing that got me with the cats is that these animals climb trees all the time. And so that's the defense. It's just to, we tree them with dogs, to get the collars on. And it's just like, boom, right up. And they don't seem to have any problem. I guess it's a matter of duration, for one thing. It's not just a...
If you're doing it all anaerobically, then, what's their buffering capacity?
Exactly.
How long's it taking to
Yeah.
get back?
Yeah, and that would be brilliant. I'll tell you one thing I do want to do is on necropsy, when you look at the muscles of these animals, they're white. They are the lightest pink that I've ever seen. They have no myoglobin in them at all. We've measured that, but we haven't done the fiber typing yet because we didn't have, basically the chemicals set up to do it. But it's something where I've always wondered if they're just a power animal and that those white muscles are really fast twitch fibers that are driving them, and they just can walk for long periods, but very, very slowly. So yeah, I mean, one more good question. So, all right.
Maybe we can
All right, thank you.